The term anthropology comes from two Greek words that together mean the study of humanity. So far as this class is concerned, we'll describe anthropology as the scientific study of what it means to be human. Inherently interdisciplinary, anthropology is at the intersection of the biological sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities. In the United States, anthropology's interdisciplinarity has traditionally been expressed as having four domains, which are usually called the four fields. These are archaeology, biological anthropology, linguistic anthropology, and cultural anthropology. These four fields arose as ways to answer the same key question: what makes human beings unique? We can think about this by considering characteristics that make humans unique among animal species. Humans, for example, shape their environments to a greater extent than any other species, and this is the focus of archaeology. Humans have a unique biology, but we also share aspects of this biology with closely related species, especially our fellow primates. This is the focus of biological anthropology. Humans have unique systems of communication with features that are not shared by any other species that we know of, and this is the focus of linguistic anthropology. And finally, human beings rely very little on instinct. Most of the things that we think of as instinctual turn out to be cultural. We rely on models for how to act in the world, and this is the subject of cultural anthropology. So let's take each of these separately. Archaeology is the study of human cultures through their material remains. There are several sub-branches, including prehistoric archaeology, which is studying the human past of societies without writing through their remains. Here's Miami anthropology major Andy Upton studying pictographs in the American Southwest as part of this. A second subdomain is historical archaeology, which studies the human past in societies that do have written documents that you can use to contextualize what you're finding. Here are some Miami anthropology majors learning archaeological methods while excavating an historical burial site in Ohio. Another branch is underwater archaeology, which is the study of submerged archaeological sites. And here's Devin Fastnow of the class of 2014, who was once an undergraduate associate in this class. And there's the archaeology of contemporary life, or sometimes just called material culture studies, which is the study of the material culture of the recent past and the present. Biological anthropology examines the ways that humans are biologically similar to and different from other animal species. Here's anthropology major Jacqueline Ramsey of the class of 2004, who now works at the Tulane National Primate Research Center. Biological anthropology, too, has several subfields. There is primatology, the study of non-human members of the order of mammals called primates, to which humans also belong. And here's primatologist Dr. Linda Marchant of Miami and a gorilla skeleton. There's also the branch of biological anthropology called paleoanthropology, which is the study of human evolution based on the fossil record. Here is Dr. Scott Suarez explaining features of human skeletal remains to some anthropology students, including Colin Brand, class of 2014, who was a UA in this course and is now studying biological anthropology at the University of Oregon as a PhD candidate. Another branch of biological anthropology, which has become very popular on television lately, is forensic anthropology. Forensic anthropology uses anthropological knowledge to identify human remains at crime scenes, battlefields, and sites of possible human rights violations. We don't have a course in forensic anthropology right now, but students learn the basics of skeletal analysis at Miami's biological anthropology teaching laboratories as part of our introductory courses. Linguistic anthropology is the study of how humans use language and other symbols to communicate. Linguistic anthropology also has a number of subfields, including historical linguistics, the study of language change over time, the ethnography of communication, which is the description of the contexts that make human communication effective and meaningful. Here's Miami professor emeritus Jim Hamill taking notes as he listens to Nepali teenagers tell him about their lives. There's also sociolinguistics, the study of the relationships among language variations and social contexts. Here we have linguistic anthropologist Dr. Leighton Peterson teaching a Miami anthropology major how to use transcription software in our linguistic and cultural anthropology teaching laboratory. Finally, there's cultural anthropology, which describes and analyzes the beliefs people have about their social and material worlds and the ways that these beliefs affect human action. One of the key aspects of anthropology is its interdisciplinarity, then. Many of the most interesting things happen at the intersections of the four fields. But in this class, we will focus primarily on cultural anthropology. Some of the many topics that are included in cultural anthropology are questions like, how do humans acquire culture? What's the relationship between language and culture? How do people organize their social systems? Why do societies create systems of hierarchy and inequality? How do people manage internal disorder and relations between communities? How do people understand marriage and family? And how are family relations linked to other forms of social organization? How do societies manage economic survival strategies among the poorest? What creates disparities of wealth and poverty, and how are these managed? What's the relationship between societies and the natural conditions in which they exist? How do people get their food, and how do they understand what is and isn't good to eat? How do people express their values symbolically through art, language, theater, movies, and so forth? What are the central myths of society, and how are these enacted in ritual, and how are these organized into a religious system? How do people, ideas, technologies, money, and symbols flow across social and cultural borders? How are humans categorized into different kinds of people? And how is this diversity managed? How do cultural systems change over time? How are relations between the sexes organized? And what beliefs do people have about what it means to be male or female? How can we apply the anthropological knowledge that we gain and the anthropological perspective to help alleviate or solve human problems? In other words, anthropology pretty much studies anything that has to do with human beings. Now, this raises an important question. How is anthropology different from all the other sciences and arts and humanities disciplines that study human beings and their works? There are, after all, a lot of human sciences. If you open up your Miami course bulletin and go through the list, you'll find all kinds of them. You'll find architecture, art, human biology, classics, communication, economics, family studies, geography, history, linguistics, marketing, political science, psychology, sociology, religion, women's studies. All these different disciplines are defined by their topics. Each focuses on a different aspect of the human experience. In order to study the human experience holistically, anthropology is defined not by a topic, but by a perspective. Now, different anthropologists define this anthropological perspective in different ways. For purposes of this class, I'm going to suggest that the anthropological perspective has 5 key characteristics. Anthropology is relativistic, empirical, adaptational, some prefer the term evolutionary, comparative, and holistic. And I'll take each of these separately, beginning with anthropology is relativistic. Most cultures, including modern civilizations, are basically ethnocentric. They use their own values and norms to evaluate the behaviors of others. There are reasons why such insular worldviews are adaptive, but if one wants to take a broad scientific approach to humanity, ethnocentrism won't do. Anthropology advocates instead relativism, a perspective that requires anthropologists to interpret specific cultural practices and values in the contexts of the people who live in them. I have a friend named Ken who's an evangelical Christian. Ken and I go way back to high school, and one thing I've always known about Ken is he likes to play practical jokes is perhaps too strong a word. He likes to do social experiments on people. So shortly before I left for India back in the early 1990s, I was staying with Ken at his home in Chicago, and he insisted that I needed to come to church with him. So I went, and I don't know if you've ever been in an evangelical church, but It's essentially, except for a lot of singing, there's one long sermon or homily given by the minister, and this one was all on the dangers of relativism, and the essential gist of it was that relativism, a belief in that any value is as good as any other value, is leading to the downfall of Western civilization and Christianity and all that is good and happy and worthwhile in the world. And after the service was over, Ken says, no, you have to come back and meet the minister. And so he brings me back and he introduces the minister. And I can see from the grin on his face by this time that I've been set up. And of course, sure enough, the minister had been told there was going to be an anthropologist in the audience, which is why he'd picked this topic. And so he says to me right off, what did you think of my sermon? And I said, I don't think you and I mean the same thing by relativism. I told the minister that there's more than one kind of relativism. Let me identify three: methodological relativism, theoretical relativism, and philosophical relativism. So first, there's methodological relativism. This is the position that all social action is data of the same type. That is, if we want to broadly compare human beings, we cannot categorize the data based on our experiences, our own culturally shaped experiences. Now, as anthropologists began to apply methodological relativism, evidence mounted over the years that led most anthropologists to embrace, as a fundamental assumption, the position of theoretical relativism. This is the assumption that all human social practices make sense in their own contexts. What this means is that for anthropologists, no society is considered crazy or evil or savage or backward, no matter how silly or repugnant or even horrific their practices may seem based on our own cultural values. Rather, we assume that all these practices make sense within some frame of reference, and our job is to figure out what that frame of reference is. Relativism assumes that different people see things differently based on their different life experiences. Now, what most critics of relativism, like the minister that Ken took me to see, are talking about is philosophical relativism, the notion that every value system is equally valid and needs to be accepted on its own terms. Few people are actually philosophical relativists. No anthropologist that I have ever met would be willing to say, well, genocide isn't for me, but it's okay for the Nazis. The fundamental problem of philosophical relativism is well illustrated in this Calvin and Hobbes cartoon, which I hope you will enjoy. The second part of the anthropological perspective states that anthropology is empirical. And by empirical, I mean that anthropological knowledge is acquired through observation or experimentation. The research method that is most associated with cultural anthropology is called participant observation, in which the anthropologist participates in the lives of the group being studied as fully as they will allow, while at the same time being committed to detailed observations and description. Anthropologists sometimes describe the data derived from participant observation as falling into two categories, using terms borrowed from linguistic anthropology, etic and emic. Emic data refers to information that describes what the world looks like from the point of view of the group, why they do what they do, how they explain things. Emic data has several distinct advantages. It helps focus on holism and relativism, which are important parts of the anthropological perspective. It also is very practical and ethical. But emic data can provide problems as well. Emic data runs the risk of particularism, of creating detailed descriptive accounts of a specific culture with no analytic value. Emic data can also lead you to avoid analysis by simply allowing your informants' explanations to become the analysis. Etic data, by contrast, are data that are gathered from the observer's perspective. Etic data consists of things that we can count and measure, and of outside perspectives that we bring to shed contrast on local perspectives. gathering edict data has advantages, the most important of which is that it helps us see what else is happening that the insiders might miss. But it also has risks, including the risk of overgeneralization and the problem of introducing your own cultural categories under the guise of neutral analytical concepts. Ideally, in good ethnography, etic and emic data should coexist in tension with one another. Anthropological explanation should at once be true to the group's shared worldview and step back and contextualize and analyze that perspective. One way to think about the anthropological ways of gathering knowledge empirically is to compare it to biology. For example, if I want to study mice, I can do one of two things. I can take my mice into a laboratory and run behavioral tests on them, and I can monitor and control them and set up experiments. I can cut them up and see what they're made out of, and I will learn a lot about mice as biological specimens, divorced from their normal non-laboratory contexts. Many social scientists seek to study human beings in just this manner. Or I can go out into the places where mice live. I can map their environments, I can run fiber optic cables into their warrens, I can sample population growth, I can look at the predator populations, I can explore environmental pressures and see what they eat and how they gather it. In sum, I can learn about mice as they actually live in relation to their environments, both their social environments among other mice and among other species, and also their ecological environment in terms of the food and the kind of soil and so forth. Anthropological fieldwork usually seeks to study humans in ways analogous to this ecological approach. Anthropology is interested in all human beings at all times and at all places. So anthropology can be said to be evolutionary, and many of us are interested in how we came to be where we are now. I prefer the term adaptationist to evolutionist in order to talk about cultural change over time, because adaptationist draws attention to the central point of evolutionary theories. Whether groups invent new practices or beliefs, or whether they learn them from others, they do so in ways that help them cope with their physical and social environments. So anthropology assumes that all societies are changing all the time. Traditions, however, only continue when they serve some function in the present. So let me give you a quick example from my own field sites. Let's look at the evolution of women's dress in Egyptian factories. Now, as you can see in this picture from the 1950s, women working in factories in Egypt at this time didn't wear the veil. But, as you can see from the picture on the right, 2 out of 3 women were veiled in this Egyptian factory that I visited with some Miami students on a field trip in 2010. Now, if you think of evolution as an orthogenetic process, that is, as a kind of a number line going from traditional to modern, then this story should make absolutely no sense to you. Or you have to try and explain how come people are going from modern clothing backward to traditional clothing. The actual story is much more complicated and much more interesting. Head coverings originated among desert-dwelling peoples as a way to regulate the heat in the desert climates, to keep your head cooler in the daytime by deflecting solar rays, and to keep it warmer at night by covering it and holding heat in. Over time, veils came to be a form of modest garb among Christians, Zoroastrians, and later Muslims, who were all commanded that women should be modest, and so veils became one of the ways of expressing that modesty. As Islam came to dominate the Middle East and Egypt, veils became formalized as a specifically religious form of dress for upper-class women at the Mughal, Abbasid, and Ottoman courts. Now, as in most hierarchical societies, those with aspirations for mobility emulated the upper classes. So veils became the aspirational class garb, and people who could afford to wear veils because they were not working in fields where long veils might be uncomfortable, but people who could wear veils did. Eventually, those aristocratic Islamic empires fell, and Europeans colonized the Middle East. And colonial regimes that came in from Europe assailed the veil as a kind of backward dress. Well, now that the colonial regimes were in place, those with aspirations for social mobility desired to emulate these new rulers of Egypt, first the French and then the British. And so middle-class women began to unveil beginning in the 1920s and 1930s, and by the 1950s very few middle or upper middle-class women took the veil anymore. Now, in the 1970s and 1980s, economic downturns forced more and more women into the workforce. And these economic conditions were often blamed on the westernization of the economy, which led to less desire among people to emulate Western ways. Meanwhile, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and some other Gulf states established headscarves and sometimes full face coverings as normal religious garb for women. So as respectable middle-class women began to leave their homes for the workplace, many worried about their reputations. So women borrowed this Gulf model, or variations of it, to show that they remained respectable even as they entered into public spaces and worked. So adopting the veil becomes a kind of, is tied to women's economic mobility, not to some kind of crazy backwardness. And that's the simplified version. There's a whole number of political, religious, social, and economic factors I didn't even mention, but you get the idea. The main point here is that cultures adapt to changing contexts. There are no magical forces pushing societies from traditional to modern, from savage to civilized, or from backward to advanced. So the takeaway is that there are no straight lines from past to present. People change according to shifts in economic, political, and cultural contexts, and that is how anthropologists understand change over time. The fourth aspect of the anthropological perspective is that anthropology is comparative. This is not a hard perspective to understand because every cultural contact moment is always inherently a comparative one. Comparison to one's own culture isn't simply convenient, it's central to the entire anthropological enterprise. Comparison helps us to understand what it means to be human, to increase self-understanding, and to understand others. So what can we learn by cross-cultural comparison? There are at least 6 ways that cross-cultural comparison is valuable to anthropological study. First, it allows us to assess human variety. Second, it helps us to identify and celebrate the distinctive, things that are unique to particular communities. Third, it is crucial to help us reduce ethnocentric bias. Fourth, it is a key to the scientific project of discovering human universal patterns of behavior. Fifth, it is only through cross-cultural comparison that we can document change or stability. And finally, comparison with others can help us to see ourselves more analytically. In the interest of time, I'll just give examples of 2 of these. Reducing ethnocentric bias and seeing ourselves more analytically. One of the ways that cross-cultural comparison helps us to reduce ethnographic assumptions is by confronting assumptions that we take to be logical, reasonable, or even self-evident with actual data. Take, for example, the assumption that people with low levels of technology are primitive and necessarily worse off than civilized populations. This assumption goes back at least to the 17th century, where the philosopher Thomas Hobbes introduced into social theory, writing that so-called primitive life, he says, in such condition there is no place for industry, no culture of the earth, no account of times, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Anthropological studies of hunter-gatherer societies discovered something quite different. And there was a whole series of these in the 1960s and 70s before states began to forcibly settle their hunter-gatherer populations. They found that hunter-gatherers actually tend to work fewer hours than workers in industrial civilizations. Right? They don't work all the time to make a living. They actually work fewer hours. And they enjoy much more leisure time, during which they employ that time in social activity and in verbal art. And they make do with less stuff. And they usually don't feel that they need more stuff. They're quite happy with things the way they are. Thus, this assumption, taken for granted by most people in the West for over 300 years, proves to be merely an ethnocentric bias. So what do I mean by that? To see ourselves analytically means to use the lenses that we use to observe others to see ourselves in a new light, to learn more about ourselves, to learn about ourselves through the detour of the other. For example, early in the 20th century, an anthropologist named Bronislaw Malinowski studied the people of the Trobriand Islands. These people had amazing nautical technology to create outrigger boats that would travel up to hundreds of miles, and they wove star maps that let them navigate the Pacific Ocean. These voyages were the basis for trading networks, political relationships, and social and economic status. But the Trobrianders, in spite of their technology, also practiced magic. They sought to enhance their boats and their navigational skills with spells to give their boats better chances of voyaging successfully and returning home safely. Malinowski theorized that the Trobrianders used magic to overcome their fears by giving them a sense of control over dangers like storms that their technology was not proof against. He generalized that whenever people are engaged in important activities that have an element of risk, they will create practices for managing that risk psychologically if they can't do it technologically. In a later essay, Malinowski argued that one could find examples of magical thinking in Western modern society as well. He gave the example of advertising, but my favorite example is actually elevators. One of the places that I always see magical thinking is in the elevators in the buildings where my offices are. Students are on the way to class and they are stressed and they decide they have to take the elevator for whatever reason instead of the stairs, so they go to the elevator and they push the button. So what happens? They push the button and they wait for the elevator to come, and a circuit has been made and the elevator will come, but it will follow its typical pattern. It will hit each floor that a button has been pressed and eventually get down to where the student is. But the students grow impatient and they press the button again, as if a second press will make it come faster. And when that doesn't work, sometimes they will press it multiple times. Sometimes they will even press very fast, as if they're magically telling the elevator how fast they want it to go by how fast they're pressing the button. This is Malinowski's magical thinking in a nutshell. What we see happening in this example is that the anthropologist describes and analyzes practices in one society that don't occur in ours or in other societies. The anthropologist then derives an analytical concept like magical thinking from this. That anthropologist or other anthropologists then find examples of this concept in completely different practices in totally different societies, like advertising or elevators in our own. Okay, finally, anthropology is holistic. One way to understand this is that instead of taking all of the complex elements of human society and reducing the variables to find one or two causal elements, anthropologists try to understand and theorize humans in all their complexity. Holism, then, involves bringing together many different facets of a people's way of life, social, religious, economic, political, linguistic, and so forth, in order to provide a nuanced context for understanding why they do what they do. Let me give you an example from my own research on Pokemon in Egypt. I got interested in Pokemon as a global phenomenon, and I decided to see how it worked in Egypt. The best place to study children's play with Pokemon turned out to be schools, so I began fieldwork in an upscale private international school where several of my children's friends attended, both Egyptians and children from other nationalities. It quickly became clear that the affluent kids who went to the international school had very different kinds of experiences and practices with Pokemon than did middle-class kids in Egypt. So I found a second field site, a middle-class private school, where students experienced Pokemon not through the imported games or cards, which most of them couldn't afford, but through other kinds of goods like clothes and stickers and stuffed animals and plastic toys and so forth. The students at the international school could afford the electronic games and the cards and videos and other important Pokemon stuff available at high-end specialty stores. A game changer occurred when Lay's potato chips decided to offer little plastic collectible discs called Tazoo in their potato chips. Suddenly there were Pokemon goods which middle-class kids could afford to collect and trade. Some kids would blow all their lunch money on bag after bag of the snack-sized chips, hoping to catch 'em all. At the same time, middle-class kids started learning more about Pokemon as popular magazines began running articles about it. As the market expanded, so did opportunities to make money. High-end counterfeit Pokemon cards selling for less than the authentic imported Pokemon cards began to appear. As far as I could find out, these counterfeits were made in Turkey, and most of the Egyptian retailers didn't actually know that they were pirate merchandise. The same can't be said of cheap local pirated goods like Roquemon crisps, locally manufactured corn snacks that just shamelessly used slightly modified Pokemon artwork to sell the snack food. Then, unexpectedly, Pokemon arrived on television. Until the year 2000, shows made for kids were pretty much only aired during the holy month of Ramadan, when families could all watch TV together. Now, Egyptian state television decided to have 1 hour of children's programming every day after school. The first half hour was for an Egyptian version of Sesame Street, Alam Simsim, while the second half hour was going to be Pokemon, dubbed in Arabic. Now, this opened up some really interesting language issues. What do you do with the names of the monsters? The fiery lizard Charmander, for example, is an English word, Charmander, combining char and salamander. In Japanese, its name is Hitokage. In French, Salamesh. In German, Glumanda. There are also different Cantonese and Mandarin and Korean names. But in Egypt, they decided to just keep the English names and not try to come up with names that would be meaningful to Arabic speakers. This backfired on them because words that don't appear to mean anything in your language could mean anything. And anti-globalization groups began circulating flyers that claimed that the names meant blasphemous things like "say no to God" and "say no to the Prophet." Many people began speaking out against Pokemon, especially parents, and it was actually banned in some Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. In Egypt, many people pointed to the ban overseas and forbade their kids to spend any money on Pokemon stuff. Okay, I could go on and on about this. I've written a lot about it, but I'll stop here. The point is that I started looking at play, which led me to study schools, which in turn revealed issues of class, which was tied to consumption, and especially consumption of technology. Consumption is also tied to global trade, and of course to marketing, which requires attention to language and identity, and unexpectedly religion. This is what anthropological holism is about. So that's the anthropological perspective. Relativistic, empirical, adaptive, comparative, holistic. Anthropologists apply this perspective to everything that we study, from Pokemon to people's magical behaviors. What we're going to see in the rest of this class is the application of the anthropological perspective to every conceivable kind of cultural domain, and see what the application of this perspective can teach us about human action that cannot be found in other ways. I hope you enjoy it.